The whirring of machinery was the soundtrack to Mark's life. Day in, day out, he tightened bolts, his movements robotic, his mind numb. The factory floor was a symphony of clanging metal and hissing steam, a deafening roar that somehow only intensified the silence within him. He felt like a cog in a giant machine, replaceable, insignificant. He ate lunch alone, the greasy spoon's aroma doing little to mask the tastelessness of his sandwich. His co-workers, boisterous and full of life, seemed a million miles away. Mark, trapped in his own world, could only watch from a distance. His apartment, a cramped one-bedroom on the wrong side of town, mirrored the emptiness he felt inside. Sleep offered little solace, his nights plagued by dreams of endless assembly lines and faces he couldn't quite place. It had started in high school, a whisper in the back of his mind during a particularly nerve-wracking history exam. He'd been struggling with the essay question, the weight of everyone's gaze pressing down on him, when suddenly, a voice, clear as day, filled his head. "The Treaty of Versailles, you idiot!" it hissed. "Focus on the economic implications!" Mark had frozen, heart pounding, convinced he'd lost his mind. He looked around frantically, but everyone seemed oblivious, their faces buried in their exam papers. Hesitantly, he jotted down the words echoing in his head, surprised by their clarity and accuracy. At first it had been exhilarating, this ability to tap into the thoughts of others. Mark only used his ability sparingly, mostly for harmless pranks at work, where he was known for his quick wit and playful nature. He also used it to gain an edge in his weekly poker game with his buddies John and Mike, who had been his friends for years. John, a burly mechanic with a booming laugh, was the life of the party, always ready with a joke or a story that could make everyone laugh until their sides hurt. Mike, quieter and more introspective, was a dedicated schoolteacher, his patience tested daily by a classroom full of teenagers who often pushed his limits. They met every Friday night without fail, a ritual that offered Mark a brief respite from the monotony of his life and a chance to unwind with his closest friends. He never revealed his secret, of course, but he enjoyed the subtle manipulation, the way he could predict their bets, fold when he knew their hands were strong, and raise the stakes when he sensed their doubt. It was a game within a game for him. "You're on a winning streak tonight, Mark," John would bellow, slapping him on the back hard enough to make him cough. The camaraderie was palpable, and the room was always filled with laughter. "Must be your lucky night." Mark would just smile enigmatically, the guilt gnawing at him even as he raked in the pot. He knew he was bending the rules, but the thrill was too enticing to resist. The arrival of the new inspector threw the factory into a frenzy. Anna, they called her, a woman with a stern face and a no-nonsense attitude. Her sharp eyes missed nothing, her crisp, authoritative voice sending shivers down the spines of even the most seasoned workers. Mark, like everyone else, found himself intimidated by her. He hated the way her gaze lingered on him, as if she could see through his carefully constructed facade of indifference. He hated the way her presence disrupted the rhythm of his work, forcing him to be more present, more aware. "She's a real dragon lady, that one," grumbled Carl, the old-timer who worked the station next to Mark, spitting tobacco juice into a nearby can. The incident with the pen happened during Anna's second week. She was in their section, her eagle eyes scanning the machinery, when she suddenly stopped, her face contorting in panic. "My pen," she muttered, her voice losing its usual sharpness. "I've lost my pen." It was a simple silver pen, nothing fancy, but the frantic way she was searching for it, her composure cracking, hinted at its significance. Mark, drawn in by her uncharacteristic vulnerability, found himself tuning into her thoughts. Grandma's gift, he heard, the thought tinged with a sadness that resonated with his own. Her last Christmas. He looked down and saw a glint of silver beneath a heavy toolbox, almost invisible in the dim light. Without a word, he walked over, picked up the pen and handed it to Anna. Her relief was palpable. "Thank you," she breathed, her fingers closing tightly around the pen. That night, as Mark lay in bed, the encounter with Anna replaying in his mind, he found himself thinking about the pen, about the story it held. A grandmother's love, a cherished memory, a tangible link to the past. It struck him that everyone carried such stories hidden beneath the surface, invisible to the casual observer. He thought about John, his boisterous laughter masking a deep-seated fear of losing his wife to cancer. He thought about Mike, his quiet demeanor hiding a fierce protectiveness for his students, many of whom came from broken homes. And he thought about Anna, the stern inspector, whose gruff exterior concealed a well of unspoken grief. The following Friday, Mark found himself dreading the poker game more than ever before. The usual excitement he felt for these gatherings was now tainted, the prospect of using his ability to manipulate his friends suddenly repulsive and morally wrong. He considered confessing, revealing his secret to his friends, but the fear of their judgment and possible rejection held him back. He arrived late, his usual enthusiasm replaced by a quiet anxiety that he couldn't shake off. John, ever perceptive, picked up on his mood immediately, sensing something was off. "Everything all right, Mark?" he asked, his brow furrowed with genuine concern. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Mark forced a smile, trying to mask his inner turmoil. "Just tired," he mumbled, avoiding John's gaze and hoping the conversation would end there. The game commenced, and Mark tried to focus on the cards, but his heart wasn't in it, his mind wandering to darker thoughts. He played recklessly, making careless bets, his mind elsewhere, unable to concentrate on the game. He lost hand after hand, his winnings from the previous weeks quickly disappearing into the hands of his friends. "Whoa, slow down, buddy," John laughed, raking in a particularly large pot with a grin. "You're going to lose your shirt at this rate," he warned, his tone light but his eyes filled with concern for his friend. Later that week, Mark encountered his landlord, Mrs. Peterson, in the hallway. She was a frail woman, her once bright eyes dimmed with age, her steps slow and labored. She always reminded Mark of his own grandmother, her gentle smile and kind words a source of comfort in his otherwise solitary existence. He'd overheard the whispers about her, the rumors of unpaid bills, the threat of eviction hanging over her head like a dark cloud. He'd seen the worry etched on her face, the way she clutched her worn purse as if it contained her last remaining possessions. As she shuffled past him, her hand trembling slightly, Mark felt a pang of sympathy. He wanted to reach out, to offer her words of comfort, but he hesitated. What could he say? He was just a factory worker, a nobody struggling to keep his own head above water. He found her in the building's small, neglected courtyard, sitting on a rickety bench, her eyes fixed on a patch of wilting flowers. He sat beside her, the silence stretching between them, heavy with unspoken anxieties. "They're beautiful, aren't they?" she finally said, her voice thin and reedy. "My husband planted them years ago. He loved sunflowers." Mark listened patiently as she reminisced about her late husband, her voice cracking with emotion. He heard the pain of loss, the loneliness of a life lived without her soulmate. He heard the fear, the uncertainty of her future, the prospect of losing her home, the only constant she had left. He shared his own story with her, his words tumbling out in a torrent of emotions he hadn't realized he'd been suppressing. He told her about his loneliness, his struggle to connect with others, his fear of being different. He told her about his ability, the burden it represented, the guilt it had engendered. He didn't expect her to understand, but to his surprise, she didn't judge him. She listened with a quiet intensity, her gaze never leaving his face. When he was finished, she reached out and took his hand, her touch surprisingly strong. "We all have our secrets, Mark," she said, her voice filled with a wisdom that belied her age. "We all have our burdens to bear. The important thing is not to let them define us." Mark left the courtyard that day feeling lighter than he had in years. The weight that had been pressing down on his shoulders seemed to lift, if only slightly, as he took each step away from the building. He didn't have all the answers, but he had a renewed sense of hope, a belief that connection was possible even in the most unexpected of places. It was a small spark, but it was enough to ignite a change within him. He started small, offering a kind word to a coworker, someone he had barely spoken to before. It was a simple gesture, but it felt monumental. He engaged in a genuine conversation with the cashier at the grocery store, asking about their day and actually listening to the response. These small acts of kindness began to build a bridge between him and the world around him. He stopped hiding his true self, allowing his vulnerability to show, peeling back the layers he had built up over the years. It was terrifying, but also liberating. And to his surprise, he found that people responded in kind. They smiled back, they engaged, they opened up in ways he had never expected. He even confessed his secret to John and Mike, his closest friends who had known him for years but never truly knew him. bracing himself for their disbelief, their judgment. He took a deep breath and let the words spill out. But to his relief, they surprised him. They laughed, they teased him mercilessly, but it was all in good fun. They also accepted him, flaws and all, wrapping him in a group hug that felt like a warm blanket on a cold night. The whispers in his mind hadn't disappeared. The doubts and fears still lingered in the corners of his thoughts. But they no longer held the same power over him. He had learned to quiet them, to push them aside, and focus on the positive. He had found his own voice, his own strength, and it resonated within him like a steady drumbeat. He no longer needed to rely on the thoughts of others to navigate the world. He moved forward with purpose, confident in his ability to connect and be understood.